Good morning, everyone. Hey, Karsten. I think you probably need to share your screen, right?
Yeah, that would be nice.
Let me give you
Good morning, everyone.
permission. Oops.
Hello, Mark.
Hey, Karsten.
Hi, Lorenzo. Good to see you.
Hi, Karsten. Hello, everybody. Ciao.
Hey, everyone. So, Karsten, you should have screen sharing permission, and I hand it
Yes.
over to you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll just wait a little before sorry, I need to, here it is. Okay, you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, so first of all, I'll thank you very much for this opportunity. I don't know, my wife she's cooking in the background. We have a rather small house. I don't know if you hear any noises from there or, okay, that's fine. So thanks for this opportunity to share something that is very close to my heart, and which I think is relevant to this group, amongst other things, because of its name. So when I first joined the group, I actually didn't know about this concept, the Urphänomen. I knew the word because Danish is very close to German, so we have the word in Danish as well. But I never contemplated what the deeper significance was of this idea. And so when I joined this group about a year ago, I looked into it in a bit more detail, and surprisingly, I found myself in very familiar territory in some way, because I recognized things, a kind of basic structure that I knew from what I would call my spiritual and intellectual home base, which is this Danish, not very well-known writer, lecturer, and the thinker called Martinus, who lived from 1890 until 1981. And so what I want to highlight today is simply some correspondences between Goethe's idea of the Urphänomen and how Martinus thinks about the living being. And in a sense, I've come to understand that in a way you can see Martinus as generalizing somehow Goethe's concept, and without ever, I'm quite sure he didn't know about Goethe or Goethe's thinking, but he was quite strange in the way that he hardly ever read a book, but he had this very transformative experience when he was around 30 in 1921, and I'll come back to that. So I'll try to keep this brief and sketchy. If you go to the Substack, there's this article I wrote where you can see in more detail, and I will try to make as much room for conversation as possible, because I think it's very much in the spirit of this group. So first, a little about how I understand Goethe's idea of the Urphänomen. So I read about Goethe that this insight about, I mean, it first came to him in terms of the Urpflanz, the original or primordial plant. And maybe it was in the introduction to his book, The Metamorphosis of Plants. There's this quote where he says, "It came to me in a flash." So he was walking in the Sicilian gardens, I think in Palermo, the botanical garden there, and he writes, "It came to me in a flash that in the organ of the plant, which we're accustomed to call the leaf, lies the true Proteus who can hide or reveal himself in all vegetal forms. From first to last, the plant is nothing but leaf, which is so inseparable from the future germ that one cannot think of one without the other." So it's this idea of the wholeness of a plant, which is not immediately apparent, but you actually have to watch the stages of the plant in a kind of movie. So you need these images over time that you can put together like a kind of movie to see the wholeness of the plant and how each stage is related to the previous stage in a continuous way. And so on top of that, Goethe kind of observed more generally two great driving forces in all nature. The one being striving towards greater complexity or perfection, he called that intensification, and the other being polarity, observed in plants as the interplay between expansion and contraction. And so he observed these 6 stages in the metamorphosis of the plant. First, there's an expansion from the seed into stem leaves. Then there's a contraction from stem leaves into the sepals of the calyx, it's called. And then there is a subsequent expansion from sepals into the petals, the flowering of the plant. Then contraction into the reproductive organs called pistil and stamens. And then expansion from reproductive organs into fruit. And then again, contraction from fruit into seeds. And so there's a cycle here. But because of this principle of intensification, this continual striving for greater perfection and complexity, it's not just a closed cycle, it's more like a spiral, open cycle that can go on forever without exactly repeating itself. And so these are, these are actually the kind of basic structure I immediately recognized from Martinus' description of the evolution of the living being and the structure of the living being, and even down to the peculiar fact that just like Goethe is counting on there, he's observing these 6 stages. Martinus actually has also exactly 6 stages in a kind of cyclic evolution of the living being. And so just briefly about Martinus, as I told you, he was born in 1890, he died in 1981. He wrote more than 10,000 pages. So his cosmology is comprised of these more than 10,000 pages, most of which he wrote himself, but some of it is lectures that has later on been transcribed into writing. And he had this very profound experience that kind of happened spontaneously to him. He has shared that he was a bit unhappy at the time with his life as it was. He was working in a dairy as a clerk, writing numbers all day, feeling a little unhappy with his whole situation. And he from a colleague, he heard about the idea of reincarnation and was brought into contact with a man who lent him a theosophical book that he brought home. He never got to read the book because in the very beginning, there was this invitation to meditate upon the concept of God. So this is what he did. And he was from early childhood, although he never associated himself with any kind of dogmatic Christianity, he was a very religious man. He was using prayer very much, had a close relationship to the Christ, and would often ask himself, if the Christ were in my shoes, what would he do in this situation? So he had this kind of religious flavor in his character. And when he sat down meditating upon the concept of God, he came into this, it happened over 2 days, this kind of transformative or even transfigurative experience. And he said very briefly that it left him in a state of conscious immortality and with the ability to see that only life exists and that God's being is present in everything and everyone. And the remarkable thing about this experience was that it's not something that just faded away. It wasn't a glimpse. He found himself profoundly changed and having new capabilities that he never knew about before, which he himself called intuition. So he described it as the intuitive capability kind of being born within him and allowing him to acquire insights by simply, if he was thinking about a problem or somebody asked him about a problem, he would immediately feel, sense, conceive of answers that would address these problems. So he spent the rest of his life, the 60 years onward, he spent sharing the fruit of these insights in his book and in his collected works. And one of the things was that there's a kind of similarity to Goethe is that he says about living beings in general, that all beings in their highest and innermost cosmic analysis each constitute the same kind of being. They're all human beings in their highest cosmic analysis. So it's like the plant being a leaf in different stages of metamorphosis, but he's talking about the living being of one particular kind that then metamorphoses into all these different kinds that we experience in the observable world. I have to see if I can move this a little because I can't see everything. I don't know do you know that, Matt? If I can, yeah, I can move it a little here so it gets in the bottom instead. That's fine. Okay. So first a little about, so apart from writing all these books, he did a number of symbols through which to share his insights. And he said about these symbols that it's actually, he wrote in his capital work is called Livets Bog. It means the book of life, but he wanted the international title to be the Danish expression, Livets Bog. Just like we say, for instance, the Kabbalah or the Bhagavad Gita and so on, and we don't think about what it means. So he wanted, I guess it was because he didn't want it to be confused. I mean, you can think of a lot of people who will call the books the book of life. So you want, but probably not so many in Danish. So he wanted to be called Livets Bog. And there he writes in the beginning, in order to understand properly my form of illustration, it must be borne in mind that the mental or cosmic realities expressed by my pictures have no material or physical form, but are identical with cosmic universal laws, fundamental principles, ideas, causes, and what he calls methods of sensing. So, and he goes on to say, sorry, I think I have to, yeah. So he goes on to say, but realities which have no material pictorial form cannot, of course, be reproduced, copied, or photographed. Consequently, my illustrations are in no way identical with photographs or artistic reproductions of what they represent, as might be very well be the case, for instance, with a geographical map. So these symbols, they do not depict the spiritual world, but they are more like pointers. And ultimately, they point to an experience that we can have. Something we have to, deep down to understand, we have to experience it ourselves from within. It's not, you could say, propositional knowledge that he's conveying here. There's this, you need somehow to become a participant in the understanding of these ideas and actually experience them as a part of your own being. Yeah, so the first two symbols that I will briefly explain are simply called the living being 1 and 2. So this is kind of his, he never used that word himself, of course, but I think of it like somehow his ontology. So he's saying that the basic constituent of the universe is the living being. So the one on the left is the living being 1, the one on the right is the living being 2. So it's two different symbols of the same basic reality. And if we take this, the triangular one here on the left, then he's saying about living beings that in every living being in the universe, and there is nothing but living beings according to Martinus, there's this basic polarity between an unmanifested, unnameable, something that is, that's what he calls it. So in a sense, it cannot be perceived or even conceived of. But he also calls it the self or the I. It's kind of the holiest of the holiest in Steiner's terms. So it's the core of every living being, and it's not manifest, and it cannot become manifest. But it's the source, the basic source of all kinds of manifestations. And then in the bottom level, you have a representation of the organism. So the circular figure represents the physical organism, and then the other figures represent some spiritual principles that are working in manifest reality behind the physical organism. And not all beings have a physical organism. According to Martinus, all have a material organism, but it's not necessarily physical. It can be subtle, more subtle levels of materiality, so to speak. And then the mediation between these two polarities is what he calls, it's the middle section here, or symbolized by the middle section. It's what he calls the faculty of creation and experience. And he says about this faculty that it kind of fades artistically into the unmanifest reality. So on top of this middle section, there's a brighter part that symbolizes what Martinus called the primordial desire. So in the living being, inherent in the living being, there's a primordial desire for manifestation and experience. And then there are some core talents, basic talents, or talent kernels, you would call them, for manifestation. And there is exactly 6 of these. So that's a very strong postulate to come with, that every phenomenon in the universe can be explained as and every manifest phenomena in the world can be explained as some combination of these 6 basic faculties. And I'll come back to the figure on the right, but just describe. So here's another quote from Liebe's bow, where he names these 6 basic faculties, and the faculty of creation and experience, that's the 7th one. He also called that the mother energy. And so if you go from, first you have red, then you have orange, then you have yellow, green, blue, and indigo. And red is instinct, and he means pretty much the same thing with instinct than everybody else. So it's you could say automatized behavior in the living being. Then there's what he calls gravity, or the energy of gravity, and it shouldn't be confused with what the physicists call gravity, because this is conceived by Martinus as an energy that works radially from the center towards the periphery. It's an expansive, explosive energy. So instinct energy culminates in the plant kingdom. Gravity, as Martinus conceives of it, culminates in the animal kingdom. Then you have feeling, the energy of feeling, which culminates in what he calls the real human kingdom. And we are not there yet, because that's a kingdom of, it's a physical kingdom of Christ-like beings, as Martinus saw it. So we're all evolving towards that state, but we are actually all living in Martinus's way of looking at things in the animal kingdom, in the latter part of the animal kingdom. But to the extent that our humane, let's say, abilities and characteristics has evolved, we are coming closer to this, what you call a real human kingdom. And then you have 3 spiritual kingdoms: the kingdom of wisdom, where intelligence is dominating, the intuition, the divine world, where intuition is dominating, and then finally what he calls the kingdom of bliss, where it's memory. And a strange thing about Martinus is that he says that this kingdom of bliss is actually also what we know from nature as the mineral kingdom. And then that needs some kind of explanation, but I hope I can have time to come into that. So these are the 6 kind of basic energies that in some combination explain all phenomena in the manifest world, where the 7th is kind of the overall coordinating faculty, and the other 6 are what we actually experience in the manifest world. And you can also see that in the bottom here, these 3, so he used the term X, because the mathematical term X, because it's an unknown we're talking about. And in essence, the whole living being, it's a trinity that basically is an unnameable something that is. So he also talks about it as 3 different analyses of the same thing. So the unmanifest aspect of the living being he calls X1. This faculty of creation and experience he calls X2. and then the manifest reality he calls X3. And the manifest reality is always there, and it has always been there, but it's changing its form all the time. So it's all the time it's metamorphosing into new forms. And so when he put these three together, you get this image on the right, which sometimes is called his main symbol. It's called the living being 2, but it's also called the sons, the Godhead and the sons of God, I think it is, and also the eternal world picture. So it's kind of an image of the most ultimate principle at work in life, so to speak. And you can see when he put them together, you have this, the unmanifest realities is, I mean, he doesn't use this word, but I understand it is kind of a continuum. I know Whitehead says something like that, and that's how I understand. It's uncountable. It cannot be divided. But you get the appearance of individuality, sorry, when you combine it with this faculty of creation experience and the organisms, because that together creates what Martinus calls the principle of perspective. So in essence, there is only one kind of living being, and in a sense, only one living being. But due to this fact that reality is always manifest, and living beings manifest in different organisms and have different perspectives on the same reality, we have, and this is also an eternal thing. So these individual living beings, they are, I mean, I'll borrow a term from Whitehead again, eternal objects. They're there all the time. They never vanish. We cannot, according to Martinus, lose our individuality, but it can be intensified, and there's a kind of rhythm in evolution where in some parts of evolution we tend towards losing our individuality in the oneness of all, but it's always to some extent retained, and then there's a contraction, and we have our individuality renewed. And so I talked about, so here you have red. So there's a journey you can make through this symbol as well. So in one sense, it could be a macroscopic being with its different organ systems, but this macroscopic being is at the same time a space for microscopic beings, micro beings, to live and move and have that being within. So we create, even with our own organism, we create possibility for evolution for other minor organisms, organ systems and cells, and even smaller life units that kind of live and move and have their being in our organism. And of course, the ultimate macroscopic being, and in a sense also the ultimate microscopic being, is the Godhead itself. So there is some kind of difference between the Godhead as the unity of all that exists and the individual living beings, the manifold. And Martinus will say about the oneness that it longs for the manifold, and the manifold that it longs for the oneness. And it's this interaction between each living being and the oneness of all living beings. So you could say, if you look at this from the point of view of any living being somewhere in an evolutionary cycle here, what is experienced is the Godhead, but filtered through our natural environment and through our own organism, of course. Yeah, it's a lot to say in a few words, and I just want to move on to these two images, and then I think I'll stop a little to make room for conversation and questions. But the one on the left here is called the combinations of the basic energies. And so in essence, these 6 basic energies, they are always combined. They're never isolated. They're always present, all of them, in any kind of phenomena, the way Martinus sees it. So at the bottom here, you actually have what you'd call the mineral kingdom. But this was also, from a previous spiral cycle, the highest spiritual kingdom, the kingdom of bliss. And in this kingdom, the faculty of memory is dominating. And that's the polar opposite to the faculty of feeling, which is our ability to experience our environment. So for a mineral being, it has, you can see it has, according to Martinus, intelligence, and it also manifests physically due to the energy of gravity, and it has some instincts, but it mainly is living in an inner world. So it's basically what it's doing, according to Martinus, is that it's memorizing experiences from the whole spiral cycle that it has just finished. And then when you move up to the plant kingdom, you have intelligence comes into its minimum phase, and then the polar opposite, which is instinct, culminates. And then you have gradually, you have some kind of feeling of vague sensing of the environment, but there is no nervous system. So there is no physical expression of the intelligence energy. So there's no kind of analysis happening in the plant, but it has a vague sense, according to Martinus, of it can respond to changes in the environment, heat or sunlight or the opposite. And then you also see you actually have intuition and memory. So the plant will also be somehow memorizing what happened in the previous spiral cycle. And also, Martinus would say that as long as there's a flower, the memory of a higher world cannot be erased, because flowers has this genius ability actually to express ideas in physical form. So there is some kind of intuitive capacity, but it's kind of packed into the instinct. So it's happening automatically without the plant having to do any work to understand things. And then we get to the animal kingdom. You can see intuition vanishes. And Martinus called the godless, materialist being, he calls him or her the perfect animal. Because here there's no longer any kind of understanding of the world, in a sense, and in particular of the spiritual world. And you can see gravity, that's also the principle of killing, that's culminating. Instinct is gradually taken off as intelligence grows. And you could also see that memory, so here we should understand when memory is culminating, the living being, according to Martinus, will remember millions and millions of years backward, each experience that it's had in every kind of detail. Whereas most of us, we cannot even remember in all detail what we did yesterday, say, or even this morning. So the faculty of memory is gradually fading away, but the energy of feeling, which is also the capacity for love and compassion, is growing towards its culmination. And once compassion and intelligence mutually has been harmonized, then intuition starts kicking off, and then we enter this initiatory path that eventually will lead us to Christ consciousness. And so the last image is this image called the spiral cycle, where you can see that, so there's a repetitive cycle here. So you can see you have the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, kingdom of wisdom, divine kingdom, and then the kingdom of bliss, which becomes a new mineral kingdom, and then there's a new plant kingdom. But it's an open spiral cycle. So what you have here is you have different principles of organism, as Martinus would call them. And the one in the middle is the organisms as we know them from ourselves. Beneath that, you have organ systems, which are also living beings evolving in their own spiral cycle. And then you have cells, and you have what he called matter particles, and he never specifies exactly what he means by that. I think of it as perhaps, protein structures or something like that. And then it actually, according to Martinus, it goes on infinitely inward. So, and inside here, so you have a kind of a cosmic octave here. So beyond the human organism and the organisms of animals and plants and so on, you have planetary beings, then you have solar system beings, and then you have galactic beings. And we're actually all evolving according to Martinus, and that sounds kind of crazy, but we are evolving toward a state where we will become planets in the next spiral cycle. It's not something we have to worry about now because we have a lot of ground to cover before we get there. But eventually, that's his vision. And so also if you move onward up beyond galaxies, you have something which would be a macrocosmic matter particle in an even larger universe. And also there are other cycles here that he didn't get to describe. I know about one where he described 14 spiral cycles where there's a new variation. And my sense is that the variation maybe goes on forever as he saw it, but he never got around to explain that. He felt there was enough food for thought in what he gave us here. Yeah, I have more to say, but I just want to break off here and allow for say conversation. So I just have to find this place where I stop. Yeah, how do I do that? Just a second.
I stopped it for you.
Oh, thanks.
You're
That was very nice. Yeah, so yeah, Lorenzo, please.
I wanted to ask you in the first the first slide, the second image, the circle divided by 6 with the Godhead in the center.
Yeah.
There are a couple of shapes. Can you put it back on?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. So I just have to. Good to see you, Aston, and good you can help me stop my screens. So I'll just put it back on here. Yeah, I'll just. Can you see it now?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're
the...
thinking about there's this star, the
Yeah,
pentagram.
exactly. Yeah, because there are 6 principles, but then we get this 5-pointed star.
Yeah.
And then like a single sphere inside that kind of a blob. And I was wondering, what was that? Is that 1 + 5 equal the 6?
No.
No.
It's the 5. The pentagram signifies this experience that Martinus himself had in 1921. He called it the Great Birth, and it's, according to him, it's the birth into Christ consciousness. And it's something that all human beings are evolving towards, whether they want to or not, or whether they know it. Of course, you cannot enter. I mean, you need to want to. It's not like it's happening automatically. We need to participate, but we will all eventually become. We will all, in his view, eventually desire to participate. Why shouldn't we? But it's simply as simple for this. And the reason why there's 5 is because one of these 6 faculties that we have is always dormant. And so when we enter the real human kingdom, it would be memory that is dormant. But we need a conscious control over the 5 other faculties. And so far, what he called earthly human beings, terrestrial human beings, do not have conscious control over this energy of intuition. That is something that only happens once you've been. I mean, so according to Martinus, it starts as glimpses. So you will have some experiences that will give you a taste of what Christ consciousness. For example, you will experience your own immortality. That's an example that he would give, and suddenly you feel certain that you are an immortal being. So these are glimpses of intuition, but it's not something we can control. But at some point it becomes a capacity that we can use, just like we now use our intelligence, for example, willfully. So that's the reason why there's a pentagram. And the other figure, that's planet Earth as a whole. So he's talking about the planet Earth as a whole. So the planetary being is a being in its own right. And it's actually going this experience of the Great Birth right now, as Martinus is describing it. But there's a difference in temporal perspective. so it's like there's in the Bible there's this saying that one day for God is like 1,000 years for man, and the other way around. So Martinus actually was quite specific here. He said that the planetary being in its own experience of time is around 30 years old now. I mean, I don't know how we can find out whether that's true or not, but that's what he said. And it has previous just like Martinus describes it, the planetary being has previous reincarnations, and it has now matured. It has been in a repetition of its earlier lifetimes, and now it has finished its repetition, and it's going through this initiatory experience into Christ consciousness, and it's happening for the planet as a whole, and that at the same time create the environment that we need to enter this initiatory path into Christ consciousness. Yeah, can you help me again, Aston?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Karsten. I had 2 questions. The first was, are you aware of any, was Martinus aware of Goethe himself, and had he written about similarities between his approach and Goethe's? And then my second question is, there's this wonderful quote about the cosmic analysis that was, conducted by him, and I'm curious if you have any insight into his contemplative practices or meditations in which he would, foster this intuition.
Yeah. So the first question, I'm quite sure Martinus didn't know about Goethe's ideas. I mean, he may have heard his name because Goethe is such a famous figure, but he hasn't read, I'm quite sure about that, any of Goethe's things. And he actually said that it was part of his mission not to, I mean, his life was somehow planned for him, he explained, in such a way that he wouldn't read books. He had a strong desire to read books, but he was born into a very poor family, and there were no external factors that allowed him to read books. But he had this strong desire for knowledge. But he later felt that it was actually part of his mission to demonstrate that you can acquire this kind of higher knowledge from within without reading about it, without studying it. That's once you've reached a certain level of maturity, that becomes possible to have all knowledge come to you from within. So he saw it as part of his mission to demonstrate that. He knew a little bit about Steiner, because the first people who acquired some interest in his ideas, first of all, there was one man that was a witness. That's the person who lent this theosophical book to Martinus that he never got to read. But he was kind of a first-hand witness to this transformation of Martinus. And he was a very skeptical man and very well versed in philosophy and different esoteric traditions and so on. And he would, with his very skeptical mind, inquire Martinus. And Martinus revealed somewhere that they spent 3 years just having dialogue, these two. And it was through this dialogue that Martinus kind of gave shape to his ideas, because these ideas came to him in a I mean, it wasn't in a spatial temporal form. So he also explained somewhere he actually had to use his imagination and his analytical capacity to kind of reconstruct the analysis that would lead to the result that was with him from the very beginning. And then there was this other question about meditation, and Martinus, he warned about the dangers of meditation, even though it's what brought him into his kind of insights. So I guess you'd have to say that at some point it just become a natural thing to sit down and meditate, but he warned very drastically about the dangers of meditation if you're not, say, if you still have ambition in you, for example, then he actually talked about it as unlawfully breaking into the temple, was the way he put it. That there's a natural organic growth into the holiest of the holiest, you could put it like that. That you don't have to force it. It will happen somehow through, say, for example, suffering is a vital factor. Through suffering, we according to Martinus, evolve our compassion for other beings. And then this compassion, it needs to be balanced by intelligence. And the way we evolve intelligence is solving practical problems in our everyday life. So the best kind of practice you can have is being a considerate and say caring being, and also having a good handle on your practical problems in everyday life. And then he was more talking about prayer. So he thought a meditation where you have the Godhead on the other end of the line, so to speak, that was a safe method. So he would more use the term prayer, but actually in his first book about prayer, he also called it meditation. The title of the book was simply Meditation, but later on, especially in the 60s and the 70s, when he saw all these young people venturing into transcendental meditation and things like that, not knowing what they were doing, he became very cautious about speaking of meditation. So he would talk about prayer because he thought that a strong relationship to the Godhead will somehow protect you from the worst dangers. Yeah, I hope that was answering.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, Karsten, thanks so much for introducing us to Martinus. Aside from your mentions of him in earlier sessions with us, I was not familiar with him at all. And there's quite an extensive website collecting his images and work. I can't help but compare him to another European mystic German, in this case Jakob Böhme, who similarly was not educated and he was just a shoemaker, right, and had this experience one day. I don't remember what age he was, but I think close to 30 at least. And from that point started writing. And there's a challenge, I think, for us who are mostly intellectuals to try to, we want to come in and interpret what he's doing and compare it to other things we've read. And I find myself trying to do that. And I feel like I'm immediately blocked from the deeper meaning that he's trying to convey, because my not intellect in the sense that I think he means it, but my abstract mind is trying to get in there and do some kind of an analysis to decode what's going on. And my feeling life is telling me, no, don't go in that direction. That's not what he's trying to communicate. But the connections that you did draw to some of Whitehead's ideas and to Goethe's ideas were very helpful. This idea of there being one Urphänomen, that all beings are living beings, reminds me of a work that's ongoing for me to understand Goethe's articulation of the Urpflanze as this particular archetypal power at work in the metamorphosis of plants in a more universal sense, as what would be the underlying archetype that's manifest in plants, yes, but also in animals and human beings, in atoms, planets, at all scales, right? And I think that what Whitehead articulates at a more generic level and a metaphysical level as concrescence, it's a way in which the environment enters into a new individual, and so it's this pulsation and this polarity where, if you want, the periphery becomes the center, and then the center becomes the periphery again. And I think that if we're trying to understand the Urphänomen in a cosmic sense, it needs to be more generic, not abstract, but more generic in a sense, so that it applies at all scales to all beings. And then the other thing you shared, that Martinus says, not only are all beings living, but all beings are some kind of human. It reminds me, humans at a different phase of metamorphosis, I suppose.
Yeah.
Reminds me very much of this. Maybe you've heard of Alan Watts, this British philosopher. I forget which lecture it was, but he described how the whole world at every level, every being thinks that it's human, but we're all on various sort of stages on the path towards the realization of that humanness. And I'm quite taken by that perspective, because it makes the anthropos something like an ideal that, or a cosmic telos perhaps, that we're all striving for, and not quite there yet. But yeah, very stimulating presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I have something more in addition to what you're saying here, because I mean, I at one of our meetings, I had this kind of, let's call it a cosmic glimpse when I was 25, that kind of brought me onto this path that led me to Martinus and his understanding, and I spent a lot of time with that. But at some point, I actually went back to philosophy, and I started studying German idealism, and also I mean, Jakob Böhme is certainly one I think also reminds very much of Martinus in many ways. But also, I mean, today I heard this podcast. There's a woman, I can't recall her name, but she's written a book about Schelling and his Platonic mysticism, as she calls it, in his early phase. And the way that she describes him being a mystic, because a lot of people studying Schelling wouldn't like to use that phrase about Schelling, but she thought that it was quite adequate, because he was claiming some kind of higher insight to things that are not shared evenly by all human beings. So you would sometimes call it intellectual intuition, for example, but you would have other names for it. And so that was the mystical part, but that was not in contrast to the systematic philosopher. And so one of the ways that I actually feel I came to understand Martinus better, and also see him in a wider perspective and context, is that he also has this combination of both the mystical insight. He claims some kind of higher capacity to look into things, but he's also very systematic, and he has some very strong claims that you can actually, in some sense, verify or the opposite. I mean, one of the things, for example, that he goes into very strongly is the role of sexuality in evolution. And he, even back in the 1930s and 40s, would predict a lot of the development we've seen in recent years in our understanding of gender and sexuality, because he believed that we are moving towards a state of evolution where there will be balance between the masculine and the feminine. And I do it like this because he actually believed that we have a sexual pole in our head, that our intellectual desire is also sexual in some way. It has these connotations of pleasure and well-being, but if you're a man in physical form, your intellectual pole will be feminine, and the other with women, he would say, they have a masculine intellectual pole, but this polarity needs to be balanced. So eventually we'll be these beings, according to Martinus, that are neither masculine nor feminine, but both. And we need to be able to play on the whole piano, so to speak, to be perfected human beings. So he would also say about himself, if he was asked about his matrimonial status, he would say he was married to all of humanity, and he was very, I mean, not I mean, he was very passionate about this relationship that he had to all humanity. It was not, I mean, there's an element of sexuality in it, and according to him, everything that brings pleasure somehow is a part of our sexuality, the way that he saw it. And so he has these claims that you can actually somehow verify. And I've seen your hand, Lorenzo, but I just, because there's one important thing here, and that's, I mean, it's called Urphänomen. And there's this concept, Urphänomenologie. So where's the phenomenological aspect? And there's one slide here more that I want to show, if I can do that briefly, and then I'll pass it on to you. So I just have to share my screen again, if I can find out how to do it there. So there's this image that kind of describe the phenomenological aspects of this whole cosmology that I've very briefly sketched here, and it has to do with this principle of cycle. That so there's I mean, there's a rhythm of the heart, for example. So there's an expansion and a contraction. There's the breath, you inhale, you exhale. So these are rhythms. And I mean, in each cell of your body, you have numerous rhythms. Then you have the daily cycle. So the black circular disc on top is nighttime, and then you have midday, the white circular disc. And so it's this spiral cycle. But what he's describing here is that in principle, it's actually the same as the daily cycle or the annual cycle, where you have winter solstice, and then you have summer solstice, and then you have the equinoxes. Or it could be the cycle of a human life, where winter is somehow the time where you're out of incarnation and childhood, and then you grow into maturity, and then you grow old, and then you come back into the winter time, into the spiritual world once again. And so the spiral cycle is the same. So you have, if you look at the bottom, you can see this is our experience of life. It's actually where we are right now in the evolutionary cycle, according to Martinus, and that could be hard to believe. It's actually the experience of life contracted to its lower limit, you could say, because our experience is kind of closed off from the immensity of the spiritual world and all the possibilities that we have in the spiritual world. And so at some point in a faraway future, there'll be some kind of summer solstice in the evolution of consciousness. So all the wars, all the suffering, all the sickness that we experience in daily life is a part of this natural process of conscious experience of life coming into its winter solstice. And also we know that, I mean, the coldest part is after the onset of winter solstice. So in the part where the animal becomes endowed with human intelligence, this is actually where suffering will be culminating. And in particular, Martinus would talk again, I talked about this, the godless materialistic being as the perfect animal, where the experience of life is at its minimum. And then once we enter into this initiatory path towards Christ consciousness, it will be evolving for an unforeseeable future into this culmination in what you could call the cosmic summer solstice. Now I found the button now, Astron. Yeah, Lorenzo.
Yeah, this last image was very relevant to what I'd like to say. I'm not really sure where I'm going to, but I'll try. if we speak about Urphänomen, let's say the Urphänomen of the cosmos, the one Urphänomen, then we get this dialectic, this dualism between a circular, complete representation that has the problem that does not doesn't have novelty, just nothing new ever. One is closed in the circle, or the linear growth.
Yeah.
And I think that when one relies on the image of the spiral to convey the idea of a synthesis between these two poles, there is a fallacy, because the spiral always goes out of the picture, and when something goes out of the picture, then that's not really a phenomenon. I mean, we are implying something more. The phenomenon is just the picture, and so when we are to think about an Urphänomen that represents the whole, and not just its circularity, but also the possibility to create novelty, so some creation out of nothingness. And I would add some annihilation also, maybe some things that are no more, so change, or more generally. Then we need representation of a picture that has a source, maybe a source and a sink inside of it. And that's something I see in Martinus, like the first image we looked at, we got that pyramid-like figure, the triangle divided into three levels, and the first level, the topmost, is a source, because it's like or like the outside of the second image is the unmanifest.
If I could say something here, Lorenzo, according to Martinus, it's actually both the source and the sink. So any kind of experience will kind of turn around, in it will fade into unmanifest reality and then come back as a new manifestation. And this is where this is actually where the sexual poles are. So according to Martinus, the masculine pole is a source, the feminine pole is a sink. And the connection is from unmanifest to manifest reality when you talk about this source and sink. So this is also where there is this aspect of novelty and creativity and unpredictability. And also I get that there's a danger here when you have, I mean, you can, and you see that actually in the culture around Martinus's work, that some will see it and have no problem with it as some kind of Spinozic determinism. And also, I remember from our talk last night that Matt, he had some thoughts about the possibility of novelty and a concern here, you could say, in how we interpret Steiner and his views. And you get the same problem with Martinus, that you have to really think deep, not to end in this kind of determinism that you have in Spinoza's worldview, for example. That would be a fallacy, I think.
Yep. Yeah, I think that there is a possibility, if we think about one image, one Urphänomen, that, I mean, even if it's a moving image, it's like a circular movie, like a loop that repeats on itself. So it's something closed that I can conceive of in instantaneously with my mind, and at the same time having different sections that are characterized by something that stays and something that is introduced, something that is eliminated, and the interactions amongst these different parts. And in this way, one can picture one image that is always the same. And I think that's important. It's the circle part of the equation, and it's what makes it really cosmic. Otherwise, we have to imply something, as I said, that goes beyond the picture. But at the same time, since in itself is an image of novelty, is an image of invention, of creation and annihilation, even if it stays the same and one can, as I said, conceive of it instantaneously in their mind, it still does not constrain us into a closed universe.
No, but this is also where we have to remember that these are symbols, as Martinus explained. So they're not the picture of the thing, but they are pointing towards something. They, in a sense, they are pointers to be transcended somehow. And I think you have to remember that all the time. And I think that goes for his words, his concepts, and so on as well. That, I mean, it is like this. The name that can be named, or the Tao that can be named, is not the eternal name or the eternal Tao. And also we have to come back to what Martinus is talking about here is actually something that he calls an unnameable something that is. And I understand as something that is never exhausted in any kind of conceptualization. It doesn't mean that concepts then can be more or less accurate in the way they point to this reality, but they can never exhaust. So this is a part of the picture as well. I mean, I see we've spent an hour now. I have lots of time, but of course I want to respect that these meetings are normally set to 1 hour. So I don't know if, yeah, Matt, please chime in.
Yeah, I have a few more minutes, and I can't help but just add here, and thinking about the difference between a sort of closed deterministic circle and this open spiral that might take us out of the cosmos, in a sense that you gave us Goethe's image of plant metamorphosis, moving from seed through the process of leaves to the flower to the fruit back to seed again. And you mentioned from Martinus that the I is always present, and in some sense what the metamorphosis of plants is showing to us is the way in which we can move from the seed as the kind of densest expression of the I through to the flower, which in a way is, as the plant moves through flower and fruiting, it's like it's in its most expanded state, and it's reaching down into the ground, it's reaching up to the sky, and it's trying to synthesize earth and sky in some sense to produce a new seed. And this isn't just a repetition. And if we bring in Whitehead's idea of concrescence here, there's a cumulative process going on. So every concrescence, Whitehead says concrescence is the process whereby the many become one and are increased by one. And so with each pulsation, something new is added to the universe, just as with each process of plant metamorphosis from seed to new seed, the environment in some sense is changed by that cycle of plant growth. And so when the new seed takes root, it's in a different universe, right? And so there's a building process amidst the cycling process. And so no two seeds are identical, right? And so there's some mysterious, incomprehensible, I hesitate to say synthesis, integration of the circular and the spiralic going on here, in the sense that, yes, there's an iteration, a repetition, but there's a accumulation as well, so that, no two plants develop in the same environment. No two human eyes develop in the same environment, because each I through each lifetime is changing the environment.
Yeah, I get that. And also, it's what Goethe called the intensification.
Yes.
This continual striving for greater perfection or accumulation of previous experiences into what is created anew. Actually, there was a Danish guy. Unfortunately, it's in Danish, but he wrote a small thesis about Martinus and Whitehead 10 years ago or so, 10, 20 years ago. But as I said, it's in Danish. But maybe I can get a copy of it, and I guess
If you can find a PDF, I could
translation.
ask. Yeah, I could ask AI to translate for me.
Exactly. Yeah. So I can find it for you. But it was. I mean, it wasn't. I think it was quite basic. He was doing a bachelor, I think, in philosophy. But it might be interesting to you to see some of these correspondence that he found between Whitehead and Martinus. So I'll try to find that.
Great.
Yeah. Guess that's it for today. I mean, I have one more image, but on my Substack, there's this article that was also shared, and I think this is a good place to end the conversation. So I'm just happy I could share these ideas with you guys.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karsten. Really appreciate the introduction to Martinus. And you can find, if you haven't already read it, Karsten's article on this is on the Urphänomen page, as well as Karsten's Substack page as well. And anyone else who's interested in doing a pop-up like this, do reach out. We'd be happy to host that. All right, everyone. I'll see you on Tuesday.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.